If you knew hooks in Drupal 7 and you were a master and you were able to like place blocks and put custom content in your blocks and whatnot, and all of a sudden you're trying to do the same thing in Drupal 8, there's going to be a learning curve. There's going to be annotations, which, as Toby was saying earlier, that can be pretty complicated because if you think annotations are just comments, annotations are the piece of code that comes before the function. If you think it's just comments and you leave it out, your stuff is never going to work. The plugin definitions, I mean, you have to know what kind of plugin you're building for it to work. And then there's managers and all sorts of different things. What else are they? They're small pieces of functionality. They're swappable. So if you have, like I said, I mean, if you have an image matter and now you need to do something different with that image, you can just swap that out and it should work the same way. They are essentially, this is an oversimplification, but essentially they're object-oriented info hooks. I mean, they're, it's an object. You can play with it, but it still has the same information. Yeah. So let's go into some examples because, like I said, we have to go a little bit fast. So here's an example. If you're trying to create a new field type in Drupal 7, you were going to use the hook field info to let Drupal know about your new field. You were going to use the schema to let Drupal know where to store that information. You were going to use field validate, probably, to make sure that your field, if it's a phone number or an email, it has meets certain criteria before actually storing into the database. And a hook another hook to let Drupal know how to tell if this field is empty. You will also use stuff like a formatter info and a view to let it know how, when you're trying to render this field, how should it look, what functions need to run in order to get this displayed. And last but not least, there was a widget for that field, right? So you needed to get the info in the form. This is where you would put all the extra stuff, like the secret sauce, where you would do any user configurable parameters that you needed to pass into the field, you would put them in here, right? So 3 basic things that you need to do for to create a new field in Drupal 7. If you knew how to do this, I mean, most of us did it for a long time, so this was second nature. You were just going through the motions and through the checklist. In Drupal 8, all of those 3 steps are 3 different types of plugins. The one where you provide information about the field is a field type plugin. So you're going to need, in your module under source, you're going to need one field type plugin. Then the field item base has the schema, metadata, and validation all into one. And then your field formatter is going to be, that's going to be your 3rd type. So, and like I said, I mean, this one is exactly or pretty equivalent to the formatter view. And then the widget itself is just a subclass of widget base. So what does this mean? Drupal comes with everything pre-digested, if you will. All you have to do is extend that basic way of doing things, and then just either extend it or just use it as it is. So we're just basically subclassing of a widget. So plugins. The word plugin sounds vague, or at least it did when I first heard it. It helps when you put names or specific names to it. So blocks. Blocks in Drupal 8 are plugins. So if you've ever built a custom block, you've already used plugins, so it's no big deal, right? Input filters, entity types, field widgets, field formatters, all of those are plugins. There's views-related plugins, there's actions, there's image effects. Anything that needs to be extensible, anything that you built for Drupal that someone else needs to take and do something with it, or even replace it completely, is a plugin. Like I said before, there's a lot of things that they share in common with services. They have limited scope, and they do one thing, and they do it right. What I mean by that is you don't have, a plugin is not a module. It's not going to do multiple things. It's just going to do one thing. So I have a plugin for, going back to the example, resizing images, and that's all it does. It doesn't do anything else. It doesn't do anything crazy like adding meta information, controlling how the file is served, whatever. There should be something different for that. They use PHP classes, which are swappable. That means there's architectural architectural patterns that you can use. You can use factory, singleton, all of those things to make sure that those classes are swappable. What I mean by that is we had this way of communicating with our web service. Now we have this second version of it, right? So we just swap it out, and it just works. So how are they different from one another? The main difference that I found was if in the interface it is expected that it's always going to yield the same behavior, that's going to be a service. Otherwise, it should be a plugin. Like I said before, this is kind of hard to read, but what I mean by that is what I said earlier. If it's something that you're going to be reusing from place to place, like the instance of loading additional information for nodes or a piece of information, then you would go with the plugin. If you're just extending something that already exists, like a block or a field type or whatever, then you go with a plugin. Question?
Yes, question about the, so you mean that now plugins are more simple in implementation in the sense that they are focused on one thing at a time? That means that, for example, if I am looking for some kind of plugin that manipulates different formats or different things into images, probably they will separate different plugins.
Yeah. So let me give you a better example. So we know we have one of the plugins that we saw earlier was blocks. So your customer tells you we need a way to place on a page a particular image, but we need to do some things with this image. So we're going to have a basic image, and we need to fetch some information on top of that, and we need to somehow burn it into the image, right? We need to regenerate that image with some burned-in information, because that's what we want to do. So that's two parts. So placing the block and letting Drupal know about your block, that's a plugin. Getting that extra information in the part of the plugin that handles the display, the rendering of your block, there's probably going to be a line that calls out a service, which should be loaded via dependency injection, another term that you're going to be using a lot. So you're going to build a service that, given an FID for an image, it'll go fetch, and maybe some other parameter to know which information to go get. It'll go get that information, return it as text, and then your block is just going to take care of like doing the burn-in or whatever of the image. So your block is only going to do one thing, and it's like handling that, and then everything else will be a service. So when you need to do, so then you have a block that renders an image with some text burnt into it. Now, if you need to do something else, like add another field or maybe do some resizing to it, that's going to be another service that is you're going to load via dependency injection, and you're going to just use that in that same place. So it's doing the one thing, which is placing the image. Anything else that happens is probably built somewhere else, and you can call out to it, but they're all kept in different locations. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
But at the end of what is package
in the module?
Yeah, the module they contain everything. Plugin.
Yes. So your classes, your services.
They are not separate.
It could be, and it could not be. I mean, if it's all part of the same thing, if you have this module called announcements that handles both the fetching of information and the rendering of the block, sure, you can put it in the same block. There's no limitation for that. But it could also be distributed. You could have a block or a module that handles all the communication to your proprietary business intelligence repository or separate database or whatever, or REST API endpoints. And then you can have this that only places blocks. So you can still call one thing from one block to another. There's dependencies. There's a lot of things. So I'm going to skip over a little bit of this because I really want to cover everything. So yeah, this is important. How does Drupal know about your plugin? There's 4 or 5 different ways. The first one is annotation based, which is the most popular. That means that when you write when you're writing your plugin and you're writing the functions, a plugin is basically a class, and then the class has annotations, which says this class is a plugin of type X, Y, and Z, field or block or whatever. And so yeah, so that's how Drupal knows A, that this is a plugin, B, what kind of plugin it is, and it's always following PSR4 notation. We can go into what that is a little bit later. So you can do it by that. It's the most commonly used. It's what, if you look into core, all of the plugins are done this way. If you needed a specific or a special way of doing that, you can also do it with hooks. There's a hook that you can write to maybe do different loading of plugins. Like, well, this is cool when I've built my modules, but what if I haven't built my modules? I don't really know a good example for like hooks, but there's a way to do that. The last way of doing, or the third way of doing that is YAML files. If you've played with Drupal 8 at all, you know everything is now a YAML file pretty much. Anything that's configuration, anything that has to do with structure is now a YAML file. So with YAML files, you can tell, for instance, if you're building a page handler, which is one of the plugins, you can say, you can tell it if it's a local task or a local action by just configuring that in the YAML file. So there's like the routing file, routing.yaml, and that's one good example of how to discover plugins via YAML files. And then there's static. It's very seldomly used. Doesn't really. It's not that important. Yeah, you can just read that. Well, let's go through the example. So, like I said, I mean, if you're doing plugin discovery, you're using annotations to register and show that information. For instance, if you're building a block, you would build your module. You would create a source file inside your module. You would go into a plugin directory inside it, and then you would go under block. This isn't magic. It doesn't mean that if you put your block outside of that, it's not going to work. Like, it's not that hard-coded. What really makes it tick is the annotation of the class that you built. However, well, I'm actually not sure if we would break anything or not, but I don't think this is the case. I've seen pretty bad Drupal examples out there, and they still work. But this is best practice, because now when you're going into a module, you know exactly where to look. Everything that's actionable that has custom code in it, it's going to be under source. If it's a plugin, we know that it's a plugin because it's going to be one level deeper. And then for the type of block that or for the type of plugin that you're looking for, there should be a folder, right? So if you have 4 different types of blocks, you're going to find 4 different classes in there. Same for fields and views. Yeah. Okay. So what is this deal with annotation classes? So it's a way, like I said before, it's a way to tell Drupal what your block is going to do. So for instance, if we're trying to specify that this particular plugin controls how the block is going to be displayed, we're going to indicate it by doing @viewsDisplay. Here's the example. So we have the annotation for the class. This is a chunk of code, a chunk of documentation commented out at the top of the class, and it's going to say, well, this plugin is going to handle a block. It belongs in ViewsDisplay plugins, and here's what it does. So this @viewsDisplay, that is not. I didn't write this freely. I didn't just like type whatever I wanted. It has a pattern. It's expecting certain pieces of information that you have to specify for it to work. So the first thing that I do is I give it an ID. That could be whatever. Log is probably not the best name for it. Then I give it a title, and then I give it some help text. I tell it how to render it, like how to style it when it's being rendered. And then I do all the other stuff, like do I have contextual links? Do I have what do I want to? This is what this block is going to be displayed. This is what this block is going to be called when I render it. But maybe at the admin level, when I'm trying to place it, I need a little bit more information, right? Like maybe when the user's looking at it, maybe it's just no title at all or something user friendly. But for my admin, I need them to know, oh, this is the block that does that. This is the block that does image transformations with metadata burned into it, right? And maybe at the user level, I just show it as latest news or I don't know, screen share or whatever. So this is what a plugin looks like. That's what the annotation looks like. And this part could change. I mean, it will change depending on the plugin you're using. I'm going to skip over that a little bit. Well, basically, the most important part of that is there is parameter syntax, like I already said. If you skip one of those attributes because you forgot about it, you didn't copy it over well, whatever, if you don't follow the formula, what we call it, it's gonna crap out. So you're gonna get a white screen of death. So the only important thing about this is when you're copying that plugin, that base plugin, when you're extending it, make sure you have the same parameters in the annotations. Like I said, it's not just arbitrary comments. It serves a purpose. That's formula. I think I'm going to glance over this real quick. There's 77 slides on this presentation, and we only have 40 minutes. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. I have a really good example at the end of this, so I think I want to get to that. Just making sure that I don't miss anything. Field formatter. Good. Let's get to an example. Okay, so let's say we're trying to create a new plugin to show. We have a field to render the choice of breakfast that a guest at our hotel is going to have, or at a venue, or at a wedding, whatever, right? So we have this breakfast module that its only sole purpose is to create a field which is going to ask the user what kind of breakfast do you want to have today, right? So we have a module, we have an info YAML file, and then we have the folder structure. So we have a source, the plugin, it's a field. Like we saw before, we have three different pieces: the field formatter, the type, and the widget. Type is the one that has like all the information about where do I store it, what does it do. The formatter is going to do some transformations to it, and the widget is going to control the display. Well, and any other user input that could affect the output of that. So we get this out of the box, and then so all the options are going to come from the custom field widget. So it's going to be under breakfast widget, which is located here, right, for the field widget. And it's basically going to be a function like this. There's a form element, has some parameters that you just have to like comply with. You take a value, you give it some options, right? You want to have pancakes, waffles, or fruit. Then you say which kind of element you're going to be returning. So it's a select, a drop down. You fill the options into it. You give it the default value that you picked up here, and you maybe set it as is a multiple selection, yes or no. Right? So this piece right here is going to build a drop-down for pancakes, waffles, and fruit. Is that clear to everyone here? Kinda? Like, if you read this, does it make sense what it does? I'd say about 10% of people are following this. That's fine. All right. So even though it works, it's not a good design. Why? Because we're hard-coding the presentation layer. We're specifying here how the word pancake, waffles, and fruit is being rendered, right? It's hard-coded. If you wanted to add to it, you would have to go into this file and extend it. And you can define your data there. It's not pluggable, which means other people can't, there's no way to extend this and say I want to have another module or another plugin to add a new option to it. Like maybe I don't want to only do breakfast, maybe I want to do dinner as well, or whatever. And it cannot be extended. So what about if I want to, now that I have the selection, now that I have this field that asks you, do you want waffles, pancakes, or fruit, what if I want to add like images, or the ingredients, or the price? With this setup, I would have to like go into the hard-coded version and do that stuff. So to address the problems 1 and 2, we need to add the ability to create a new breakfast item, right? Make it extensible so other people can play with it. And we need to make it, kind of like the same thing. So what would that look like? We would do a plugin. So even though we are using a field plugin, I can now build my own plugin, defined by myself, in order to share this with other developers, and they can say, hey, why don't you build a breakfast plugin? You know, it doesn't exist. Drupal doesn't know about breakfast plugins, but it does know about plugins, period, right? So now I can extend that. So I would go in here, create another, under plugins, I would create a new category, a new folder, and I would give 3 different files for 3 different classes. What would I put in it? First, I need my plugin manager, right? It's a new thing. We need a way to manage it. It's a service to manage all the different breakfast plugins that could be, right? What would it look like? It would just have a construct, and it would say, you can find my plugins, you can find the breakfast plugins under plugin/breakfast. Does that make sense? Kind of like the way Drupal does. Drupal goes and looks under source plugin block for blocks. Now I'm telling Drupal, hey, I am this thing, and you can find my plugins under plugin breakfast, right? Then I would give it an annotation name, right? So I go ahead and give it that. It is namespaced, so everything that's breakfast, anything that's annotated by a breakfast plugin is going to be under that same namespace. Plugins is the default annotation. You can define custom annotations as well. When we do the choice field, wait, never mind. That's still part of that previous example. We can do it this way, and we can provide the alter info to extend it. So if anyone wanted to alter it the way we load my breakfast plugin, they could, right? And then as caching if we want it, right? So, anyways, so back into our example, back into services YAML. This is going to have all the information about how the breakfast plugin manager is going to work. So we need to register my manager as a service, right? So we can do dependency injections, we can do all of those cool things. So we're no longer hard coding the breakfast items. Instead, we're going to dynamically pull all the plugin instances of the breakfast type. So for my options, remember how I had my options hard coded there? It was an array. It was an array of things. I had 3 options in there: pancakes, fruit, and something else. Now I'm going to call my service. I have my breakfast plugin manager, right? So I'm going to say my items are going to be whatever the service returns under get definitions, or maybe I can call it get food types, or get selections, options, whatever. And then for each one of those things that get returned, I turn it into breakfast item. So now I load my options dynamically with the options here. So what is this doing? I'm no longer hard coding the options. I have a way to get it from many different sources. Anything that's a plugin, any module that has a plugin that matches my requirements for breakfast, will be able to add options to it, right? So that means that I can contribute this module, and then people anywhere in the world can just add more options to it. So how does the annotation play into things? So if you want to build, so now we have a module that doesn't have any options at all. So I still have to put a plugin to load the basic types, or to put some content there, right? So I would start by creating the file where it needs to go, giving it the annotation that it expects. So add plugin, it's of type pancakes, and then I give it a label. And that's it. It's basically extending a base plugin, right? There's nothing here. It's just going to have the code there. So since each breakfast item is unique, we're going to have 3. Each one of the options is going to be its own little plugin, right? Because it's going to have information about, well, later on it's going to have information about the images for each one of those items. It's going to have the price for each one of those items. So like we saw before, we have this breakfast folder, and underneath we have each one of the 3 classes, right? So when we go into that plugin, we are now going to add a class for the image, or an attribute for the image, and one new attribute for the ingredients. How are we going to use that? We're going to combine it, and we're going to say the image in the annotations, right? This is not in code. This is in the annotation. We're going to tell this particular block serves pancakes, only pancakes, and here's the image for pancakes, and ingredients include flour, milk, and eggs. What does this do? This is using introspection. It's going to use this information, and before it even renders anything, you can do stuff with it. You can say, hey, get me all the plugins, but get me only the ones that don't use milk, because my customer can't take milk, or whatever, or is allergic to eggs or flour. So before even rendering anything, Drupal has a way of just building all that information up and saving a lot of time, because it's not rendering anything, it's not fetching all the images, doing all the processing. It's just going to know about it, because you're telling it this is what it has. It only does pancakes, one thing. It only does one thing, and it does it right. The other change that we have to do is in the plugin manager. So the name of the annotation was breakfast, right? So now we have to, when we're building a plugin for it, we have to tell it, well, this is other than the subdirectory, the namespaces, and all that good stuff. Now you have to give me the annotation name, but it has to be of type breakfast interface. Does that make sense? Because we now have a way of specifying what a breakfast field looks like, or a breakfast option looks like. And then we just put an interface around it. So what it ends up looking like is, for pancakes, we create a function called served with, and you can extend it and say, well, pancakes are served with whipped cream, strawberry, and maple syrup. Waffles are only served with powdered sugar and maple syrup. This is all going to make sense in a minute. So now we have an interface, which means we can tell the developers what we're expecting and how to feed our plugin. We have a formatter, right? And so for each one of our plugins, we get the breakfast item through the instance, and then we just start adding markup. This is a bad example, but I mean, this would be a theme function, whatever. This is just for demonstration purposes only. Concatenating strings is always bad. But we do have the breakfast item. It's a class, right? Because we have a plugin, it becomes a class. It has attributes. It came with get name, get image, but now it can also get served with because it's a class and it's optional. If my plugin has it, it'll call it and it'll add that to that same piece of markup. Yeah, we're not going to go into the decorators or anything like that. So for plugins, does this make sense? Was that kind of clear how you can extend it? If this was Deep Dive Drupal 101, I would have said, here's how you do a block and how you put custom content inside a block. This is one step further, where it is like I had a way of doing things. I had a block. I had a field actually. I had a field that presented 3 options, and now I need to make it more extensible so other people in my company can extend it. Does that kind of make sense a little bit? You're gonna have the slide deck so you can review it later.
So just a question.
Sí.
When you are, if I want to change the format of the display, I need to override the format, right?
Yes, you would only, well, so my plugin only serves data, right? My plugin only takes the word pancakes, the image for pancakes, and what it's served with. If you wanted to change a formatter, I would assume you wouldn't want to change how pancakes is rendered is going to be different than waffles. They should be the same. So what you would change is here, the formatter. So kind of like the way Blocks does it, right? Like there's a way to render that. If you want to extend it, one thing you could do is just add, like if it has like a variation of like images maybe, you can just add to it. But once you add to the interface, which is interface meaning this is the way we take information. If you change the interface, then you have to go retrofit most of those things into the classes that you already have. But yeah, you could either change it here or here, right? All right, so that was topic number 1. We're doing great, actually, on time. So let's see. Middleware API. I'm just going to fly through that one because if blocks or plugin API was complicated, this is going to blow your mind. Middleware API. How many of you, show hands, how many of you know what middleware is? Wow, pretty cool. That's 4 of you. So, as you know, Drupal 8 is based on Symfony. So there's the HTTP kernel interface, which runs, it's frame agnostic. It processes every single HTTP request that your site's going to be serving. And before everything's even been bootstrapped, before Drupal has attempted to connect to the database and everything, actually, kind of like midway. I mean, there's one way to do it before everything bootstraps, and a little bit in the way. It's called middleware because it happens after the request and before everything else happens, right? So it sits right there in the middle. And you can run different things really quickly. For instance, if you do know that certain IP addresses are not going to be allowed on your site, you can just go ahead and put your logic that calculates or fetches that IP address, compares it to like the ones you don't allow, or maybe only compares the ones you do allow, and do stuff there and just 404 it or 403 it right then and there. So super quick, the fastest 403 ever. like I said, it runs on every request. There's specific locations where you can put your logic in it, and you do have to like make sure that it's running at the right time. You have to make sure that they do as little input-output as possible. Input-output, I mean database queries, which at the end of the day have to access the disk, or disk access itself. If you add one slow middleware, stack PHP middleware, the entire site will be slow because it runs on every single request, right? If you're doing too much on one of these plugins, it's just going to slow your site down. What is it not? It is not a replacement for hook boot. Most of you probably have never used this. It serves very specific purposes. That's why it's there. You should never tamper with it unless you know what you're doing. This is not that. This is not a replacement for hook boot. Like I said, I mean, it has 3 different things you have to know before you can build this correctly. The first one is content negotiation. You can do, this is where you would put stuff like, do I show this content or not? If I have a quick way to discard it. Reverse proxy support, session handling, for instance. Like if you have a special way of handling your sessions, whether, like if you have, say for instance, you're serving, your website is not just HTML. It also has like web services, right? So if you know you have a JWT, JSON Web Token, to validate your sessions, you can already discard everything before it even, like as soon as it gets the request, if it doesn't come with a JWT token, for instance, right? If all your site is doing is that, and you know that this token that you're expecting is not there, you can just kill it. You can just kill the session and say, yeah, I'm not gonna talk to you because you don't have the token that I should have given you and you don't have, right? So some examples. I mean, there's a rate limiting service for API consumption. If you've ever built an API service that people have to consume, one of the biggest problems you probably run into is, how do I stop people from abusing it, right? It's a URL. People can just hit it many times and potentially just kill my site, right? Like kind of like a DDoS attack. So there's a rate limiter where you can give it a bunch of parameters and say, hey, for this IP address, don't take more than 5 concurrent connections, or keep track of how many times it's been hit in a month, and don't serve more than, say, 100 requests. When you go over that, stop serving them, right? And it's middleware. Why is it middleware? Because if it wasn't, then it would have to like access the database and do all those checks, and it would be super slow. There's even a super nice plugin for course. Do you know what course is? Cross-origin references? No? Okay. So actually have information about that. I don't care. So course. It's cross-origin resource sharing for your sites. When you have site A, UCR.com is going to share a resource. It's going to go request information from this API at, I don't know, library.ucr.com, whatever. Because you're sharing information between 2 different domains, the HTTP, what was it, standard, I guess, will say, hey, I don't know, there's something funky going on here. It's not part of the same thing. So with course, or cross-origin resource sharing, you can tell it, hey, it's totally okay to fetch information from this other domain. I know about it. It's safe. It's okay. Yeah. So there's a plugin. This was written by David Flores. He works for, I guess currently he works for Phase2. And so what does it do? How do I enable it? So you would go into your modules. You would clone it. dmouse is his username. You would clone it and you would just enable it. What does it actually do? It basically specifies the different types of methods that it's going to get. Actually, this is bad. This is a bad example. There's another file. Like if you clone this repo, there's actually the file that sets the information for the different origins here. This is a bad example. I mean, this is what it is right there. But this should be replaced with a list of the domains that you. This is basically saying when you enable this module, you're basically saying any origin anyone that wants to feed me information, I'm going to take it. So that should probably be changed now that I see it. All right, so we covered topic number 2. We have, 3 more to go? Authentication API. I think I want to just glance over Authentication API. I don't know that it's going to help you all that much. I'll just give you a quick summary. So the Authentication API is a way for you to provide to your users a standard and repeatable way to provide credentials and either gain or not gain access to your site. That's what authentication does. You can specify it on routes. You can say, hey, this particular piece of content you have access to, but you don't have access to. And there's an authentication manager. So, like I said, everything's a plugin. This is what that interface should look like, and it should have a service tag for authentication provider. The very basic example is in your, say for instance, your routes. When you're specifying, I have this mywebsite.com/sample page. That's a route, right? And it has a custom handler that takes care of building that page. In there, where you're on your routing file, on your routing YAML file, you're going to specify the path and all that information. Who's going to respond? Who's going to be serving? What class is going to be serving that page and all that good stuff? And then you can specify the authentication. So you can say, you know what? Basic authentication is fine, or a cookie can do, right? So if either one of those two mechanisms is used and it's valid, then you give them access to your content. Otherwise, you don't get access to it, right? Pretty simple. But the cool thing is you can add a number of things here. You can say JWT tokens, like I was saying before, or I don't know, a number of different authentication mechanisms. So then the authentication manager for each one of those guys, there's an authentication manager for basic authentication and one for cookies. It would just call out the different providers. So if you had one for Redis, for instance, or LDAP, the one that we use for corporate user or centralized user information, it'll go call that and return whether or not, check your access to a particular piece of content, and then return yes or no, like these credentials are valid or invalid. That was pretty good. Authentication manager, that authentication was pretty quick. Migration API. How many of you have had to do migrations, whether it's for between 6 to 7, 7 to 8? Anyone here? No? Migrations? 2, 1, okay. All right, so this is gonna blow your mind. When you're doing Drupal at a corporate level or at a certain level, there's usually the need to migrate data, right? They're hiring you to rebuild the website for a newspaper, and now they're saying, well, what are we going to do with all this content that we already have? Like, you're going to build me a brand new site. Do I have to copy everything manually? Do I have to hire 100 people to copy everything by hand? Or is there a better way to do it? So here's where the migration API comes in place. It does many things, or many useful things. One of which is, if you had a site on Drupal 7, and now you want to have it on 8, we're going to provide all the mapping and all the flows for your data to get transformed into the new locations, their new home in Drupal 8. So that's one of the things it does. The other cool thing that it does is if you have a third-party system, like a lot of the big companies have BI systems, business intelligence systems, that expose their information in different ways. Maybe they share that information in spreadsheet kind of files, or some sort of text file, or an XML file, whatever it is, or YAML files. So with the migration API, or migrate API, you can specify, let's go into it. You can specify how you're going to import that information into Drupal entities. So it can do earlier Drupal versions into newer Drupal versions. You can also do it backwards if you wanted to, but you can also do anything non-Drupal into the Drupal world, right? It's just information. I have 3 fields over here in a piece of in a flat file, and I want to provide a way to map those into actual useful information in Drupal, right? The easiest way to understand a migration is going at the import level. There's going to be a source plugin that is going to say, well, so what is a source plugin? A source plugin would be CSV files, or a particular CSV file. I'm going to say I'm going to create an importer of users. So I'm going to tell my client, I need you to export your list of users with column A is going to be your username, column B is going to be the password, column C is going to be the first name, email, blah, 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 right? So this is your format, and it has to be in a CSV file. So now my source plugin knows how to find that CSV file and just load it up. It doesn't do anything else. It just knows how to find it and load it up. It's going to return rows. Now, for each one of those rows, I'm going to have another plugin, which is going to take care of processing it. So if my password needs to be re-encrypted, for instance, if we're going to be dropping that and setting a new one, I need a processor to say, well, take this data and transform it. Or if I had two fields for first name and last name in the source, but in the destination I only have one field, then I need my processor to take those two fields, combine them, and then store it as an object, store it into just one location, right? And then finally, the destination plugin is going to be in charge of saving it, right? So it's going to, one guy loaded up all of this information, the other guy made all the transformations and revisions to it, and then this guy's just going to save it, right? Does that make sense? The basic steps of a migration? Okay, cool. So that is the basic use of migration. Now, the advanced use of migration, we have identifiers. Most of the times, you have to run migrations a couple of times until you get it right, like when you're developing it. So identifiers are pretty useful to keep track of what was what in the old system and what is what on the new system, right? So I think there's an example in there somewhere. We take a source, and if we have a way to identify that source, we will definitely have a way to identify it in the new system, in Drupal, right? Even though the source might not be Drupal to begin with, right? It was just some sort of system. It had a secret hash key for each one of the users, whatever it is. But we do have a way to tell user John was user John in the old system. It's now going to be UID 5, right? Once we save the values of the source identifiers, we can then, and we have the row hash, we can now save that into an ID map, what we call an ID map. So we have a way to say, hey, rerun this import and go up, instead of inserting those 5 users again, try and find their matching entities in Drupal. And if the information has changed, like, so there was a typo, they gave you a list of, a million users, and then they just realized that the emails were wrong, or there was a field missing, whatever. You don't want to rerun everything again, right? You don't want to duplicate data again. Maybe people have already played with it. I don't know. So when you can just rerun it, and because we know what it was before and what it is now, we can just go find that record, load it up, make the changes, and save it again. So those are what identifiers work for. So like I said, if we're doing continuous migrations, like there's still, say for instance you have a website and you're capturing leads via, Salesforce, for instance. And now, for whatever reason, even though there's a plugin or a direct integration for that, for whatever reason, the marketing people are sending you a list of new leads, right? So that allows us to do continuous migrations. We can just get, we got a batch of information today, we're going to get a new batch tomorrow, so on and so forth. So we can make sure that we're not overriding new content. So like I said before, like if we had a user ID 44, and it became 56 on the destination, we know that any pieces of content that belong to user 44 are now owned by user 56. So what does that mean? What it really means is that the new system is still fully aware of who is who between the old system and the new system. The other identifier that we have is what we call the high water marks. That is basically, one of the high water marks is when a node was changed. So the way we use that, or where it's helpful, is we can import, we can run the import in the order that they were changed, and we can save that change timestamp to know where on the list we were, right? We have a billion records that we have to process, and we don't want to be, if it craps out or we have to stop or whatever, we can still say, well, we got up to this part because we have that change date or whatever. So we know we stopped here, and then the second time we run it, like on cron or whatever, we'll pick it up from for the middle of the pile, not the top of the pile again, right? All right, so that was Migration API, super quick. RESTful web services, and I promise I'll be quick. It's also part of the kernel wait, no, that's wrong. That was a bad copy paste, my bad. RESTful web services. In Drupal 7, there were several ways of doing this, many of which included creating your own module and just finding your own way to do. There were basically two ways of doing it. You could do it the right way with the RESTful or REST services module and play along, and it was very hard-coded. The paths were very strict. It was not very flexible. Well, you could bend it to your will, but it was out of the box. It was kind of hard to get it to do what you wanted. So now for Drupal 8, we have a brand new RESTful Web Services API, which is API being the series of plugins that you have to build or write to serve a REST resource. So for each one of those, you're going to have what we call the verbs, right? Like read, write, get, post, head. So those are the verbs. And you can specify the serialization formats. So most endpoints return JSON information, but you can do JSON, you can do XML, you can do straight HTML. And then you can also say how you're going to validate the authentication. If you're exposing private information via a web service, the authentication has to be as strict as your regular Drupal site, right? So it's not an endpoint that people can just hit and get private information for users, and you can toggle through a number of user IDs and get a lot of information that's maybe unwanted on the internet, right? So there's got to be authentication mechanisms. So each one of the resources has an interface. It has a REST resource plugin. This, if you were paying attention before, this would be the equivalent of our breakfast plugin, right? So whoever built the REST API said, well, there's a way of extending this, and it's via plugins, and the type of plugin is REST resource. Without it, it's not going to work. Each resource is configured. It has all the configuration in the config entity. So it comes with a REST UI user interface to see what your service is going to provide, to control whether or not your service is available. So you maybe want to disable it for whatever reason, or you want to change the way authentication happens for that. There's a UI that takes care of that, or you can do it by hand, which is what most of us do, in a REST resource entity YAML file. Before Drupal 8.2, this used to be in REST in a single YAML file called REST settings. Now it's like a little bit more fine-grained. If you were running Drupal 8.2 and you upgrade to a newer version, any configuration that was there will be automatically migrated. Actually, if you're running anything lower than 8.2, once you go to 8.2 or later, it'll be automatically migrated. The other big difference is before 8.2, you had to grant REST-specific permissions. So you had to tell users, unauthenticated users can't access my REST API. And then on top of that, you would specify, like for each one of the endpoints, you can specify who has access to this endpoint. Let's see, blah, blah. So, just summarizing again, the REST resource annotation is going to be necessary. You're going to build, your class is going to be extending the REST resource, the resource interface. It's going to read up, it's going to load it up by reading the annotation. That's how it's going to discover it. And then you can alter that information with a REST resource alter if you need to. And then there's a class, which is the resource base, that provides the default implementation. Right. So for the formatting, by default, the REST module is going to come with JSON and XML. I won't go into too much details, but there's a module that is not enabled by default called HAL that is kind of like JSON, but has more information. Other than, on top of pushing you the information that you're requesting, it can also tell you what came after and what goes next. So it has, in a way, navigation for your web service. So if you're building a headless front-end side for your backend, or you were building a native application on your phone that's only going to be interacting with your Drupal site via the REST API, it has extra information to say, so you've requested this particular article. The article that was before it is this one, and the article that's next is this one. So that now you can use that information to create back and forward buttons, for instance, or you can, more importantly, on a multi-page registration, you can go back to the right set of information or go forward and that sort of thing. And you can install additional modules and get different formats. Like I said, I mean, if you wanted to like spit out information in a different format, like YAML or I don't know HTML, you can. What does that look like? You can do it via the REST UI module. You can just go into your endpoint and say, I want this to be formatted with XML and JSON, or you can do it in code. In your definition for your endpoint, you can just say the formats for this particular resource are HAL, XML, and JSON. And then for authentication, so if you wanted to add cookies for the authentication mechanism, same as this. I mean, for formats. So here we have formats and authentication, right? So I'm trying to show that I've just collapsed the non-important information. So in that same file, under authentication, I would just add cookie, right? And then if I do it like this, only cookies are valid. So people still have to like log in somehow. A cookie has to be written, and my web service is going to, or my REST resource is going to go find that cookie and take that as authentication. How do I build one of these guys? And then we're out of time. How do I build one of these guys? There's a scaffolding function. Scaffolding means creating an empty shell that you can start filling out, right? Like a template, if you will. There's some scaffolding code that you can generate via the Drupal console that is very popular nowadays. So if you install the Drupal console, you just run Drupal generate plugin REST resource, and that is going to give you all the files and empty files with some dummy instructions on how to create your REST plugin. If you need to see examples, I mean, that's the best way to make sure you're getting it right. For a trivial example, take a look at how the DB log, the database logging, exposes that information for consumption, for remote consumption. And if you want a really complex example, take a look at entity resource. Those are all, I mean, they're both part of the REST API. Kind of like the same thing I've been saying over and over. What's really important is to have this REST resource annotations. If you don't provide like a particular URL on how to serve your endpoint, it's going to use the plugin ID. So whatever your plugin ID is, it's going to be really important. I mean, you can change it, but if you don't give it a name, it'll use the plugin ID. So if my plugin ID is this fancy to-do list that I'm going to expose to other systems, you're going to end up with all the different verbs, get, patch, delete, /fancy to do, and then /DID, right? So fancy to do, if I wanted to see the details of one of my tasks to do, I would do get fancy to do and then DID, right? Fancy to do 1, 2, 3. And if I needed to change anything like post information to it to change the information, I would do post fancy to do. So that's the default. However, many times you want to specify your own paths. So instead of having this get fancy to do ID, or patch or delete fancy to do 1, I can just maybe want to have to do and then to do ID, right? So the way I do that is with a canonical URL path. I can also do it with the link relationships, and let's see what that looks like. This is one way to tell Drupal what other URLs are going to be serving this, right? Other than that long path that comes by default, you can just give it an alias, if you will. So yeah, so that's what that does. That's it. You made it through it. Awesome. Any questions? No? Okay. Run for the hills. Thank you very much.